Hello bookworms and welcome to episode 2 of The Bookish Haven. I'm your host AK, and in this little corner of the internet I'll be bringing you bookish opinions and literary insights to not only help you discover your next read, but also to inspire deeper reflections on books you may already have read and loved. So whether you are a casual reader or a literary aficionado, prepare to challenge your perspectives and join a community of nerds where stories spark lively conversations. So welcome, and without further ado, let's dive into the literary masterpiece that has neatly settled itself into the cornerstone of dark academia. And I'm talking about none other than Donna Tartt's The Secret History. Published in 1992, it was Tartt's debut novel, and it is an innovative, thrilling, and elegant masterpiece that leaves you feeling, in my opinion, mysteriously superior as a reader, especially with its rich portrayal of the classical studies and masterfully woven intertextual references. In my opinion, this book has to be read for its writing. It's just one of those books, especially for me as an aspiring writer. I just think it's one of those books that you need to read for how beautiful its writing is. So, fun fact, upon its initial release, it shook the literary world. It did quite well. And Donna Tartt was handsomely paid a $450,000 advance from her publishing house, which is, of course, quite big for a debut novel. And rightly so, because now the book has gone on to become a cult classic. Now, before we go on further, I'm going to walk us through a very quick spoiler-free synopsis. So, if you have already read the book, hopefully this jogs your memory. If you haven't read the book, hopefully this encourages you to read the book. So the story follows Richard Papin, a young medicine student who, to escape his unfulfilling banal life and college major in his hometown, somehow he transfers to a liberal arts college in Vermont. So he goes from studying medicine to arts, and here in this new college, he comes across a group of mysteriously alluring students who are studying the classics. And so in this group, we have Henry, who is our de facto leader. We have Francis, a Prince Nasvarian young man. He's kind of cool. Orphan twins Charles and Camilla, and Bunny Corcoran. So Bunny, amongst the five, is the most conventional, and the outsider of this group ultimately is Richard, and that's in every way, from his knowledge to his wealth. He's the outsider in the group, and therefore he's also our narrator. This group, interestingly, is taught by an equally mysterious and enigmatic Professor Julian Moreau, who selectively handpicks his students, and he only usually picks a handful of students for his classes. So once Richard becomes a part of the group, again, he doesn't become an insider as such to a huge extent, but he does become part of the group, and he learns that with the exception of Bunny, the group has committed a terrible deed. They've done the unthinkable, and this leads to a very murky tale of guilt, ambition, and morality, and that ultimately results in the death of one of their own. Now, I'm going to leave it at that because that's essentially the whole plot of the book. So I'm not going to reveal what happens, but in their pursuit of intellectual freedom and in their pursuit of this unattainable, the four students, with the exception of Bunny and Richard, go ahead and do something really terrible, and that forms the foundation of our plot. So this is a story essentially of how beauty can become terror, and it is a tale of how friendship becomes monstrosity. And most importantly, the story masterfully challenges the boundaries of what we consider right versus wrong, especially in the pursuit of ambition. So if that sounds like your vibe, if you like what you are hearing, please go and have a read, and then you can come back to listen to the rest of the episode, because now we're going to go ahead, discuss what people are saying, discuss some of the key questions and ideas surrounding this book, and there will be spoilers. But if you don't mind the spoilers, stick with us and have a listen. I'm going to now firstly go through the Goodreads reviews, and like always, I will attach all the links to the resources that I have utilized in the show notes, so that if you are interested in further reading, you can go ahead and check it out. And I'm going to cite everything I say anyways as well. So let's start off with the Goodreads reviews and what is being said. Like every book, some people love it, some people hate it, and my job is to understand why. My job is to sort of deconstruct those opposing opinions and just sort of see what is being said about the book and why that's the case. Now, on average, the book's rating is a 4.17, which I think it's pretty high, and that's from 840k ratings on Goodreads. So let's start off with some 5-star reviews. Firstly, we have Melanie, who says that I've never read anything like this book in my entire life. I can honestly say this book was a cathartic experience for me. All the characters are morally great, just generally horrible people, but you completely ignore it because Donna Tartt weaves a hypnotic spell with her writing that you feel like you are reading this book in a dream-like lull. The secret history is unlike anything I've ever read before, and I'm not sure if I'll read anything quite like it again. Now, I love this review because I 100% agree with the style of Tartt's writing. I think it does wonders to the book and to some of the loopholes that I think the book has as well. Now, I understand, again, where Melanie's coming from. I do think that the book definitely just captures you. It captures you. The characters captures you. I remember, like, the night I finished the book, I had a dream about Henry and Richard. So I woke up in the morning, I was like, oh, that's weird. I don't usually dream about books, the characters in the books, but this was one of those books where I just couldn't stop thinking about it. I actually had this book recommended to me from like a friend of mine who loved it, who was like, this is so, so good. You have to read it. And they kind of said, you know, almost has like Harry Potter vibes to it. And I was like, okay, this is interesting because Harry Potter is my favorite book. So I kind of went on, trusted them to read the book, and I must say, I really enjoyed it as well. But let's now talk about some fairly compelling and I think justifiable 1-star reviews as well. We've got Elle, who says that the fact that the climax happened around the page 200 or so and then nothing happened pissed me off. And then that was it. Nothing. Zero. Nada. I was laughing my ass off when Richard realized that Henry had not only told him what he wanted to and not the entire truth. Like, how can you be so idiot, Richard? I still can't believe that Donna Tartt decided to put Richard as the MC, the main character, or even imagined him at all. This MF was boring as hell. I love that review because Richard is 100% a bit of a problematic character, but I hadn't actually thought about the fact that he is that boring as the narrator until I read this review. So that was Elle. And then we have Jess, who says that so many negative reviews of this novel start or end with something along the lines of, I think I'm not just smart enough for this novel. Well, I have a degree in English literature and I think this novel is trash. The writing is undeniably gorgeous. The aesthetic is perfect, but it's just that, aesthetic. Richard is an unreliable narrator, sure, but not because he's morally grey or any other particularly interesting reason. He's just sort of an idiot. And then she goes on to speak about other characters, saying that they're just bad people doing bad things, most often to each other. They're essentially carbon copies of each other, archetypes with no true personality aside from 1 or 2 defining traits. Bunny is unbearable and Julian is comically underutilized. Now, what I love, and when I go ahead and pick these reviews to talk through them, I like to pick reviews that I think have valid points and that actually, it's not just, I didn't like the book, but actually explaining why they didn't like it. And I think these 2 reviews do that quite well. And I agree with some of the bits that Jess has said, especially the part about Julian being comically underutilized, because I felt the same. I wanted to see more of him. I feel like he was such an important character, but he's just mentioned at the beginning, he's there in the middle of parts, and then he's there at the end where he kind of leaves the kids on their own. But I wanted to see more of him, and I think he deserved to be seen more. And I'll talk about this later. I'm going to move on now and just quickly talk about my thoughts after reading the book before we go ahead and see what critics are saying. So again, I kind of went through the 2 ends of the spectrum with the Goodreads reviews. We've got 1-star reviews and we have 5-star reviews. Now, where do I stand? Well, I rated it a very solid 4.25. It wasn't a 5-star read for me. Like, I was definitely blown away by the writing, but I wouldn't say it was a 5-star read because of some of those things with the characterization or the plot. So essentially, I gave it a solid 4.25. And my reasoning was that the writing was gorgeous. I personally loved the intertextuality in the book. I think that was done so well. And the beginning of the book is what does the wonders. It hooks you in from the very first line. And that's hard to do. So I quite like that. And I'm also not a very big fan of first-person narration. I usually tend to stay away from books that have, first-person narration because I just find it a bit tough to empathize with the narrator a lot of the times. I just find it a bit weird. But in this book, I think it worked so well from the very beginning. Even though Richard had his flaws, I still think that there was the purpose for the first person narration, and that is what makes it so compelling. We see the events unfold from Richard's eyes, and oftentimes what that does is it allows us to question things that Richard has missed. And I think that would be really tough to do from a third person perspective, because with a third person perspective, you wouldn't see that very personal experiences of Richard and the way in which, he makes his decisions that shape a lot of the novel as well. It's quite important, I think, also the way in which the narration plays, especially towards the end. When we realize, I think before Richard, we realize like how blindly he has trusted and followed Henry. And we know the reason he's done it is because we become so familiar with Richard. We know he's done it because he loves beauty. He loves the picturesque. He wants to be like Henry. He wants to be like the others. And in doing that, in chasing that unattainable, he does a lot of bad things along with the others as well. But the only difference is that he probably regrets it a lot more than the others do. Now, the second thing that I quite like the characterization. I don't think that the characters were similar to one another. Yes, they were defining traits, and I think those were the traits that kind of tied them together, because essentially at the end of the day, they hung out with each other because they liked each other, and they sort of were mirrors of each other. I do see that, but at the same time, I do think that the personalities and the traits represented each one quite distinctly, quite perfectly. I felt like I knew each one of them personally, and a lot of the times, even when you sort of see their faults, you empathize with these characters, especially Bunny. I think he's a really good example of that, where you see his faults. He wasn't a good character. He was misogynistic, he was ignorant, he was entitled, and he was a downright bully, especially towards the end. But the thing that stuck with me the most was the fact that Bunny was, essentially the first person who actually accepted Richard. And again, the narration plays into it because we are seeing the world through Richard's eyes, and we see how out of place he feels, how much he wants to be in that Greek class, and that's what Bunny does. He offers him that, and he makes Richard belong in that group. So I do think that, in that way, we do feel a bit of empathy for Bunny, even though I'm not saying by any means is he a great character, or is he, a morally righteous character. He's not. And we also understand that when things start going wrong, I really liked how Todd showed his psychological deterioration, right? And that again makes him human. It shows like how that was a driving factor for his behavior, and that to any rational person I think would be very justified. So I love the plot as well. Now again, I was hooked in from the very beginning, and I wanted to know what they were doing, and I had my theories. I was annotating the book. It took me a long time to read because I was annotating it as I went, and again, that's because the writing was gorgeous and I really wanted to analyze it. So when I was annotating it, every time they would mention something, give us, little crumbs, I'd be like, okay, are they like time traveling, or is Julian like immortal? That was one of my theories, which a bit weird because after I realized like, oh, it couldn't be further away from what has happened. But I really liked the plot. Yes, it was introduced pretty early. Yes, the climax, does happen around the middle of the book, and then the rest of the book kind of drags on for a while. I agree with that, and I do think that pacing does throw you off at some point. Like the end, it picks up with what happens with Henry and the group. It does pick up there, but in that middle section, it does slow down a bit. What I also liked was that how Tart uses language, like how she'd been foreshadowing this idea of ultimately what happens all along. It was always hidden in plain sight. It was right there. So I quite like that as well. So the reason, like I kind of mentioned earlier, like I foreshadowed earlier, the reason it wasn't a 5-star for me was because I was left wanting more. I wanted to see more of Julian. His character was by far the most intriguing, but again, I felt like we only really saw him at the beginning and then kind of in the middle, and then he kind of becomes the focal point at the end. But by that time, it's just too late to really understand his characters. Again, I get it that the story is not about him, but he plays such a big part in what happens, in perpetuating what has happened. And he, to a huge extent, again, he's quite a morally ambiguous character as well. So I think it would have been really interesting to see more of him. Now, like I kind of said at the beginning, I wanted a bit more action as well. I know it's going to sound weird, but like at one point, after Henry had revealed what happened and what the Four did, that causes all the events, I was like, is Richard going to do it with them? Is he, so we can sort of see what it truly is, because we just see what Henry says, we hear what Henry says. So I was expecting more. I wanted a bit more there. And I do think that, it could have happened. I can easily see Richard going along with the group and doing it, because he's definitely a bit of a follow-up. But yeah, I don't know. I think when the whole thing unfolded, I do think things got a bit slow, especially after Bunny's death. So a lot of it was just revealing how things happened. It was interesting. The climax was great with what happened with Henry. But I do think I was anticipating a bit more in the middle there. But still, I think a solid 4.25 for its writing, for its plot, for how neatly it ties together. I do think that is done super well. So that is my opinion. Those are my thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts. I always see reviews about it. I do love reading reviews for The Secret History. And again, it has its takers. It has people who don't like it. And that's so fair. Everyone has their own taste, right? So now I want to talk about critics. I want to talk about a bit of research and what's being said by the academics and the scholars who have studied this text in a lot more detail. So let's start off with the paper, What Does She Think of Us, Donna Tartt, The Secret History and the Image of Classics. So this paper by Sophie Mills considers Tartt's portrayal of the study of classics. So I'm assuming that Mills is a professor of classics herself, and she kind of wants to deconstruct how Tartt portrays the study of classics in her novel. Now, I loved this paper because it kind of decoded the allure of classics that Tartt creates. It does make you feel very fancy. Like when I was reading the book, I was like, cool, like super fancy, it kind of intimidates you, the study of classics. The paper kind of goes to show that how the text itself, how the book itself engages in intellectual snobbery by sprinkling in Greek and Latin phrases, often without their English translation. And that kind of shows its intellectual snobbery, which is very similar to that of its characters like Henry and Francis and Charles and Camilla. So I think that was a very good point, because you don't realize it. When I first read it and I had to, Google what some of the sayings were, what Francis said to Henry what Francis said to Richard at the beginning when he first sees Richard. I had to sort of Google that, and I thought it was really cool to sort of see Greek and Latin phrases sprinkled throughout, but to kind of see it as like intellectual snobbery that the text is participating in is a really interesting point. Another thing that the paper kind of talks about is the otherness of the group, which is expressed through their proficiency in the ancient language of Greek. Now that obviously sets them apart from other students, and we see like how superior the group acts, and that is what draws Richard to them. He wants the beauty, he wants the picturesque, he wants, what looks good. And so I think that's quite interesting. So we can see that the way in which the group is so devoted to their study of the classics, they value it so much, and it does isolate them from the modern world around them. And we see that from their lack of interaction with the world around them, right? Like when they sort of switch on the TV, it's like they're a bit weirded out by that. Or when I think at one point Henry's a bit shocked about the moon landing. So I think it's really interesting how the book shows in a way, and maybe I'm making this up, but I don't know, I kind of feel like Tartt here comments on the power of modern day media versus like the classics. Like there's that comparison of the allure and the mystery of the classics versus the ubiquity of modern day media. So I do think that's a very interesting point to think about. Now, another fact that this paper kind of talks about, just moving on from the point before, is the exploration of the elitist. So while everyone who goes to Hampton is elite, they can afford it, right? It's a private school. Richard only gets in because he has scholarship, but the classic students are that one step above, and that's what the text shows. It makes out these classic students to be snobby, and there's that intellectual elitism of the group, and that specifically of Henry, Charles, Camilla, and Francis, because they're also financially elite. We know that Bunny is of course not in that group, because even though he has that initial place in the group, it turns out that he's been just sponging off the others, specifically Henry, and that kind of is what drives him to blackmailing the others, and then the others to do what they did to Bunny. I think so. What this paper is talking about is how Tart depicts these students who are studying classics and the teacher, Julian Morrow, to be very like intellectual snobs. And she's kind of saying that that's, obviously not the case for classics that's being taught now. So I think that's really interesting to kind of put that representation of classical students in modern day world and in like modern day institutes, and how that's not the case. One question that I did have, kind of just going off from this idea of, Bunny's place in the group, that he leeches off the others, and that ultimately leads, him to be treated the way he is. Obviously, Richard doesn't do that. He's more morally righteous than Bunny. Like, he has a lot more integrity. He doesn't want their financial help. He almost dies, Richard, when he, refuses help from Henry and the others, and he stays in that place where he gets sick and he has pneumonia, I think. So we do see that foil between Richard and Bunny to a huge extent. But what I want to ask you is, do you think Bunny deserved what happened to him? And I just want to leave you with that for a second, if you have read the book. Do you think that is what he deserved, if that was the right thing to do? And maybe you're thinking, kind of doesn't even matter if it was the right thing to do or not, because it's a book, it's fiction. But I do think it's interesting because it goes to show that, the extent to which the group of four are, and Richard, because he does play a part in what happens to Bunny, like, it goes to show how their reach for the unattainable kind of leads to these consequences. And again, Richard participates in it only because of the facade that he has created for himself, the facade that he wants to be a part of. So yeah, my answer here would be that no, I 100% don't think that was fair. Like, that's what he deserved. Again, I understand the motivations of the group, and maybe that's what Tart is showing, that yes, what Bunny did was wrong, but at the end of the day, what the others did was much worse, and they do suffer the consequences for it. So yeah, what Bunny did was inexcusable, and I think what's quite compelling is that Tart shows how unbothered the group is by Bunny's death, and by, what they've done to the farmer before him as well, right? It shows the superiority with which they think of themselves. They think they're above the law, especially the four, with the exception of Richard. So they think they're above the law. They think that, the law doesn't concern them. They think that because they are doing it for the study of the classics, because they're doing it for something that is so important and that is so essential to them, it doesn't matter. And we see it in the way in which, Henry kind of flippantly explains it to Richard what has happened. In fact, he even describes the murder of the farmer as like a minor accident. So we see how Tart shows how these students think that they're above the others because of their studies and because of the intellectual capabilities that they have, which they think puts them above the law or puts them above others in society. Like I said, I wasn't a fan of Bunny. He was misogynistic, he blackmailed the others, and he had his faults. But I do think he was the most moral of the others. So when he hears the news of the farmer's death, he's bothered by what the others have done. Could it be because maybe he's left out? Maybe that's a part of it, but I do think that to some extent he was bothered by what they've done, and I think that counts for something. And also at that point we can also think of like his other redeeming facts, right? Like how he welcomes Richard into the group. And even though he goes on to then humiliate Richard, like his psychological deterioration is showed, like how paranoid he starts to become, that shows that he probably had more of a moral ground than the others did. And you can counter that by saying, but then he blackmails out, that he humiliates Richard, because he kind of starts to figure out that Richard isn't what he's saying he is. Like his parents aren't, old celebrities. Like he probably has a very simple background. But I think that shows how Bunny's jealousy of Richard there comes from how close Richard is to Henry and the others, and how Bunny's losing his place with the others. And we know that that's because like all Bunny has is his friends, right? He doesn't have money of his own. He's relying on Henry and so on. So I think it's a really interesting conundrum of these characters, and it makes you think quite deeply about their motivations, their experiences, and it's murky. They are, I think, morally great characters to a huge extent, especially Bunny. I think he's probably the most morally great out of all of them. So yes, I think again the first person narration here is quite a good tool because it allows the readers to empathize with Bunny, because when Richard first felt out of place, it was Bunny who made him belong. And similarly, the narration, like I mentioned earlier, allows us to see what Richard has missed. It allows us to see how easily Richard has been manipulated by Henry. Richard obviously kind of worships the ground that Henry walks on, right? Like he wants Henry's approval from the beginning. He's intrigued by Henry. And so he becomes very easily manipulated by Henry. And his own embarrassment on Bunny's hands is what kind of then leads him to pick Henry's side and do what he's done to Bunny. So I think it kind of again goes to show that how in the pursuit of beauty and of a picturesque life, Richard forsakes his humanity, and that's what the text is showing. So it's showing us so many different things, like these human experiences that are so raw, and that are very, very complex. They're very nuanced. There's no right versus wrong. Shades of right, there's shades of wrongs, and I think that's what makes it a very good book to read. So another great point that was raised in that paper by Sophie Mills is about Julian. Now, like I said, I think Julian was one of those characters that intrigued me the most as well. And Mills says that Julian's affection for his students is left ambiguous, that he's undeniably seductive and essential character. So that's a quote from Mills' paper. Now, I honestly didn't give it that much thought until I read that quote, because he is ambiguous, right? Julian isn't a simple character either. Maybe it's because we aren't shown Julian that much in the book, but we realize that he's not this simple, generous character that he comes off as. My initial thought, like when I first read the book and I was reading and I was kind of, at the beginning reading about Julian's characters, he almost gave me Dumbledore vibes. Maybe I'm making too many links back to Harry Potter, but he did give me Dumbledore vibes. He was like the mentor, especially for Henry, who isn't very close to his family. Julian is his guiding light. But I think what makes for an interesting comparison again between Dumbledore and Julian is also that Dumbledore had his downfalls. Like Dumbledore wasn't a very, say what you will, I do think Dumbledore definitely had his downfalls. But I think what's interesting here is that Julian was detached from his students. Even though we don't see that at the beginning, I would have said that, he's like Henry's mentor. But once things start to go wrong, we see that, once that going gets tough and all that has happens, Julian sort of jumps the ship. He's detached from these students. And in fact, Tart, again, very masterfully, and this is something that Mills discusses in her paper, is that Tart quite masterfully draws parallels to the Greek play Hippolytus, in which the Greek god Armistice, who doesn't take responsibility for his worshippers' troubles. So that's kind of drawing the parallel between Julian as the god, the divinity that Henry worshipped, and how ultimately he doesn't take responsibility for what has happened and he just leaves. He doesn't even attend Henry's funeral, and to Henry he was like a father figure in a way. So I think that's really interesting. So we do see snippets of Julian's character, but I just wanted more, and I think he deserved a bit more of a role as well. Now, one thing that I found random that I kind of had, it was just weird, like Camilla and Henry's relationship. I'm not sure if it was like to get to the climax that happened, but it felt very awkward. And I'm not sure if that's just me and if it felt like fine for everyone else who read it, but to me it just kind of came out of nowhere. And I felt like a literary tool that was used to cultivate the climax that happened. So don't get me wrong, I loved that last little interaction between them. I think that was really good, but just in the lead up to that whole bit that they're together, it just felt awkward. So I'm interested in hearing what you have to say, whether or not you think it was awkward. So that was the key ideas that were discussed in Mill's paper. One thing that stood out to me in this book, and I kind of mentioned at the beginning, the reason I loved it was because of the intertextuality of the book, and specifically the references to T.S. Eliot's work. Now, I studied Eliot for term for school, and his poems very complex, right? Very interesting, because I think anyone who studied him for school almost has a love-hate relationship, because you kind of realize how good they are, but because you have to study them and write essays on it, you're like, get over and done with it. You don't want to do it. But when I kind of picked up on the very subtle references on Eliot's work, I was quite happy with myself. I was like, oh, I feel a bit fancy because I've picked up those subtle references. I think there's some references to like J. Alfred Prufrock at the beginning of the book, and I loved how easily and effortlessly Tart has included it in her work. Now, that's because apparently she was very heavily inspired by Eliot, and that's discussed in Frances Powell's paper, If a Winter's Night's a Reveller, the classical intertext in Donna Tartt's The Secret History. So it's quite interesting because even the name Edmund is Bunny's name, and that's an intertextual reference to Edmund Wilson's Axel's Castle, which contains a appraisal of Eliot's work. Another character that links back to Eliot is George Laforge. So that's the French professor who tries to stop Richard from choosing Julian's classes. So if you remember that at the beginning, he's the one who tells, Richard about how weird Julian's classes are. So that character is a reference to French symbolist Jules Laforge, who was an early influence on Eliot. And another super fun fact that was revealed in this paper is that the name Secret History, that title, is borrowed from the 6th century court historian Procopius's Chronicles of the Emperor Justinian. So that's because those chronicles by Procopius, that book was an account of the horrible reality underlying a facade of normality. And that's, very interesting because that's what Secret History is all about as well. It's that horrible reality of what underlies this facade of normality for these students who are studying the classics, and how that normality of their dedication to their studies kind of leads to all that happens in the book. So if you are interested in learning more about the intertext in The Secret History, definitely check out that paper. And now that brings me to the final thing that I want to talk about today, and that is the role of The Secret History as a cornerstone in dark academia. So we can see that the genre has obviously become quite popular with the rise of Pinterest and also Bookstagram. Like the number of reels you'd see with like the dark academia vibes is great. And so we can see how Donna Tartt's The Secret History has become a cornerstone of it. And so that is discussed in Simone Murray's paper, Dark Academia, A Bookishness, Readerly Self-Fashioning, and the Digital Afterlife of Donna Tartt's The Secret History. So she discusses how the key to the book's success lies in the way in which it fuses richly figurative language and a range of high cultural allusion with tight plotting. And I think that perfectly summarized the allure of the book, why the book works so well, why the writing is so well. And another thing that I again didn't realize until I read this paper is that the book itself hybridizes the genres by combining, and I quote, by combining the satirical bent of the campus novel with the plot twist of crime fiction. And not only does she do it really well, she actually goes ahead and innovates that genre of crime fiction by subverting the whodunit style of crime fiction to whodunit, because we know of Bunny's death from the very first page. So it's not about who done it. We know that the guys have done it, for group along with Richard have done it, but we want to figure out why have they done it. And that whodunit in a way is what keeps us hooked from the very first page. And of course, adding to that dark academia vibe of the book is also the description of the Hampton College. Like that sets a really good stage for what happens. And the book also utilizes a lot of gothic tropes like ravens in symmetries and full moons and paranoid hallucinations. And we see that especially with Richard's character. So it's almost this beautiful amalgamation of the genres as well as these gothic tropes that gives it that dark academia, vibe that it has, and allows it to be the cornerstone in the genre itself. So that basically brings me to the end of the podcast, Bookworms. I hope you found discussing and analyzing The Secret History fun as much as I did. Like all famous books, it has its takers, and I do think that the star of this book is writing. So if you are an aspiring writer, if you love reading good writing, I would 100% encourage you to check it out. And like I said, it does slow down a bit in the middle. It does have its weaker points. I won't say weak, but I would say weaker points in comparison to its really powerful, points. Even though it does have those, I think the book is an absolute masterpiece in its construction, in its language, in its form, and the storytelling. So I would 100% recommend it. And so that basically brings me to an end for this episode on Secret History. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe on whichever platform through which you're listening. If you would like to get in touch, talk more books, you can find me on the Bookish Haven podcast on Instagram. You can find our official page, and please follow for updates. And I hope you can join me on this journey as we go through these, literary adventures. Now, I will see you on our next episode, which will be on 1984 by George Orwell, the classic dystopian novel, and that will be up in a fortnight's time. So thank you so much for listening. Have a great week. Look after yourselves. Enjoy the holidays, and I'll be back with our next episode on 1984. And please follow along, please subscribe, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and opinions.